Every winter, tens of thousands of flights operate in conditions that would have grounded aircraft a generation ago. Snow, sleet, freezing rain. And before any of those planes leave the ground, they go through carefully timed, precisely choreographed rituals that stand between a safe flight and a catastrophe. Airplane de-icing looks routine. It isn't. The physics of ice on a wing are brutal and unforgiving. Even small amounts of ice can increase drag and raise stall speed. It can turn a routine departure into something no one walks away from. We know this because people didn't walk away. The standards that protect every winter flight today weren't written in boardrooms. They were written in accident reports, in cockpit voice recordings, in the findings of investigators who had to ask the hardest question in aviation. How did this happen? And how do we make sure it never happens again? Today we're going off the radar and onto the runway to learn what makes ice so dangerous to aircraft. We'll look at the crashes that changed everything and why even in today's modern technological world, we should never underestimate the power of ice. I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie, and you're listening to Off the Radar, a production of the National Weather Desk. On the show, we dig deep into topics about weather, climate, the ocean, space, and much more. Our goal is to help you better understand the weather and to love it as much as we do. On January 13th, 1982, Washington, D.C. had ground to a halt. A fierce winter storm had been battering the region for hours, and at National Airport, passenger-filled planes sat waiting as ground crews struggled to keep up with the icy conditions. Among those waiting was Air Florida Flight 90, a Boeing 737 bound for Fort Lauderdale. On board were 79 people, 74 passengers, and 5 crew members. The plane had been de-iced, but freezing precipitation continued to fall as the aircraft sat in a long line of departures. Time passed. Ice returned, a thin, uneven film along the wings.
I turned to my boss and said, they're going to have to de-ice us again. And when they came back to the right side, I turned and said, see? And he just laughed. But they never came back.
Just after 4 p.m., Flight 90 began its takeoff. But something was wrong almost immediately.
That the nose had pitched almost straight up.
Witnesses watched in disbelief as the 737 struggled to climb. It reached only a few hundred feet, and then it began to descend. Seconds later, it struck the 14th Street Bridge, tearing through cars trapped in rush hour traffic, before plunging into the frozen Potomac River. In total, 78 people were killed. 74 of the 79 on board the aircraft and 4 motorists on the bridge.
Recovery crews worked in the sub-zero waters of the Potomac River today, trying to recover the bodies of victims who died in that Air Florida crash.
Just 5 people on the plane survived the crash. And survival in those icy waters was its own desperate fight.
I was just floating through white, and I just thought, I'm not really ready to die.
The images from that day became seared into the American consciousness. Rescue helicopters hovering over the ice-choked river, bystanders on the bridge watching helplessly. The investigation that followed was exhaustive and damning. Investigators found that snow and ice had reaccumulated on the wings in the long delay between de-icing and takeoff. Even a thin, rough coating, something barely noticeable from the ground, can fundamentally alter a wing's aerodynamics. It disrupts airflow. It destroys lift. But that was only part of the story. The engines were not producing the thrust the crew believed they were. Ice had affected the engine pressure readings, causing cockpit instruments to indicate more power than was actually being generated. The cockpit voice recorder captured a troubling exchange. The first officer questioned the engine readings and the aircraft's sluggish acceleration. Something didn't feel right, but the takeoff continued. Within seconds of liftoff, it was clear the aircraft could not climb. The National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the crew failed to recognize the severity of the icing and the insufficient engine thrust and failed to abort takeoff when the warning signs were present. But the NTSB did not stop with the cockpit. The investigation examined the airline's training, its operational decisions, and the Federal Aviation Administration's oversight. What emerged was a system not fully prepared for the realities of modern winter operations. De-icing procedures existed, but holdover guidance was inconsistent and not yet standardized. There was no formalized, universally applied framework to determine when an aircraft contaminated by snow or ice was no longer safe for departure. That has changed. In the years following the crash of Flight 90, winter operations were overhauled. A clean aircraft concept became firmly embedded in federal regulation and operational culture. Standardized holdover timetables were developed and continually refined, giving crews science-based limits in active precipitation. Anti-icing fluids were improved to provide longer protection. Pre-takeoff contamination checks became routine, and crew resource management became a cornerstone of aviation training. 78 people did not make it home that day in 1982, but the safety framework strengthened in the aftermath and has shaped every winter departure since, and has almost certainly saved lives in the decades that followed. Our guest today is Steve Green, a retired airline captain and aviation expert with over 4 decades in the industry. He's participated in numerous accident investigations, and since the mid-1990s has focused deeply on aircraft icing, consulting for both the FAA and NASA, and writing and speaking widely on flight safety, risk management, and human factors in aviation. We're really glad he's here today to help us understand how the tragedies of the past have shaped the safety measures we rely on today. Well, Stephen Green, thank you so much. I'm thrilled to pick your brain. It seems like you are going to be a wealth of information when it comes to kind of the history of de-icing and airplanes in general and kind of forensics too. So I can't wait to hear all about this. Can you give me a little background on yourself, what your history is?
Well, I'm a retired airline pilot. I was a pilot for TWA, and then after we were bought by American, spent the last few years of my career with American. During the TWA years and the regional airline years before that, I became pretty involved with the Airline Pilots Association as an accident investigator and safety representative in a variety of venues, one of which turned out to be the Roselawn accident in 1994, the ATR crash in Roselawn, Indiana. I was called out to that site as the ALPA National Accident Investigation Board representative there. And it very quickly led to some conclusions about icing. And within ALPA, we decided to establish a in-flight icing certification project because we saw that there were a lot of problems, and the FAA was working in the same direction as well as was the rest of the world. So we ultimately got involved in rulemaking and changing the certification requirements, which took quite some time, but we did succeed a few years ago, and that rule is now in place. But that led to considerable amount of work with icing, and after the Airline Pilots Association and I parted ways because of the American merger, I was contracted by NASA to do some work for them, and then have been doing some work for the FAA for a number of years as well. So that it just sort of snowballed, if you will, into one thing led to another, and here we are.
Well, and I was snooping on your LinkedIn profile. You have education in mechanical engineering too, correct?
Yep. Went to school as a mechanical engineer, whatever that was worth. But, was particularly...
But it was helpful.
Oh, yeah. I was actually particularly fond of thermodynamics and fluid mechanics and that sort of thing. So
perfect.
It sort of set the stage a little bit.
So before the early 80s, what was the process? Was there any de-icing of airplanes, or was it like a sit and wait for things to melt kind of situation?
Well, it was actually more there was de-icing. I mean, people were aware of the problem, but there was also a considerable carryover from the general perceptions of icing, which is a linear scale. So if you look at the FAA's terminology that they still use, and a lot of us are arguing about this, have been for years, you start with trace, light, moderate, severe icing. So it's a linear scale, and it gives you the sense that icing is a linear problem. So a little bit, yeah, it's not a real problem. A little more, it's okay. A little more than that might be a little bit of worry, and it progressively works up. In fact, that's not true at all. A very little bit of icing can be a really big problem. And so, but the linear concept, and that goes back to the 1920s. I mean, we could trace that back to some research that was done then that was maybe not as sharp as it could have been. That whole linear concept gives you the idea that a little bit of it's not too bad. And so there's a tendency to not worry about getting de-iced or cleaning it off. I think about the days when I was flying back in 1980, 81, flying Convair 240s in a cargo operation at night, around the Great Lakes. And I remember dragging ropes across the wing to get the snow off. That was sort of our idea of de-icing. And I'm absolutely amazed that I'm still alive.
Oh my gosh.
When I think of with what I know today, when I think about what we were doing in those days and the perceptions, we wanted to get all the snow off, but a little bit of leftover snow was not a big deal. And in fact, it wasn't. And I think this is the second thing that it really has to be understood about icing is we all know that we don't want to fly into thunderstorms. So, and most of us who've been around long enough have actually flown into a thunderstorm at some point in our life, inadvertently or whatever, and you don't really ever forget it. It's not something you want to do, and everybody gets that. So we have radar, and we have people looking out windows, and we see thunderstorms, and we stay out of them. Because we know that 95% of the time, if you go into one, you're going to get knocked around pretty hard, and you could have a really serious problem. Icing doesn't work that way. So we end up with a considerable number of encounters that come out quite well. People don't have a problem. And so it opens the door to this idea that a little bit of it's okay, a little bit of exposure is okay. And in fact, if you're going to fly IFR, particularly professionally, like people expect you to show up there every day, you're going to encounter icing. I mean, there's no way around it. So it's a different animal. And I use the thunderstorm analogy to kind of show how different it is, because we get into it, we have reasonably good experience with it, and what we don't realize is that it compromises the critical angle of attack. So everybody understands stalls, and they understand, reaching a critical angle of attack and the lift curve.
I don't think everybody understands that. Can you explain what's happening with ice and how it's impacting the airplane?
If all wings are susceptible to stall. So, if you increase the angle of attack enough, pitch the nose up high enough, the airflow over the wing is going to separate and the wing is going to stop working. I mean, it's no longer going to produce lift, or certainly not enough lift. So all pilots are trained in this stuff. We practice stalls over and over. We practice stall recoveries. We learn how to not get into stalls. That's pretty much a part and parcel with your early pilot training. And we even continue to do that in the jets and the large transports. We go through, exercises in the simulator with stalls and that sort of thing. So that's all well and good, but the particular angle of attack or the nose-high attitude that is critical to the stall is decreased with ice on the wing. So what you thought was a safe attitude in the airplane isn't as safe as it is when there's no ice on the wing. But up to that point, you don't really sense any difference. So it's not like it's giving you all kinds of warnings. Now, sometimes it is if you're really looking and paying attention, but it's really easy to think that the ice you have is okay because you're not aware of any handling changes or behavioral changes in the airplane. And you won't be necessarily until you get to that critical angle of attack. And that varies depending on the ice shape and how much you have and so on and so forth. So,
Okay. At that point, can you recover or is
sure,
it too late?
It depends on where you are. And I mean, if you're at altitude, it's not likely to be a huge problem. It depends. For example, the Roslawn crash in 1994, that did something a little bit different. It influenced the aerodynamic balance of the ailerons. So the roll control was compromised and the airplane rolled over. And there wasn't much, if they'd gotten the nose pointed down, they could potentially have recovered, but you really needed to understand what was happening. And I wouldn't have, at the time, I didn't understand that either until we got into the investigation. So if you have the room and the altitude, it's feasible to recover from these things. The problem is most of the time they happen close to the ground, either on approach or right after departure. And then there's no room. And, you're not as inclined to push the nose down as you might be at altitude.
Yeah. You don't really want to point down when you're that close to the ground, I guess.
Right. So that's the thing. It's really subtle. It's a sly threat. And because it allows pilots to build lots of experience successfully, it leads them into a problem and then they can't understand, what happened. There was a very well-known accident back in 1940 with the DC-3 up in Moorhead, Minnesota. The captain was actually the only survivor, oddly enough. He was thrown clear of the wreckage and everybody else was not. And he made the comment in the accident investigation that he knew they had some ice, but he didn't think it was really that serious because he'd seen a lot more ice before. And except that he didn't understand that you really can't tell what you have. You don't know what shape it is. You don't know exactly where it is on the wing. And the aerodynamics get really, really kind of tricky. So your visual inspection is probably not adequate.
Can you take me through what kind of currently happens as far as this from the passenger's perspective?
Sure.
Like goop is flying out the window. That's what we see. Can you tell me from a pilot's perspective what's actually happening here?
So the idea there is when we're looking at the ground de-icing problem, we've got snow falling or freezing precipitation of some type is falling, and it's accreting on the wing. It's adhering to the wing. So it's creating a layer of ice, and we can't have that. So the process that we have evolved involves using de-icing fluids, which are various types of chemical formulations. And we typically do this in a two-step process. We use what we call type 1 fluid to remove the snow and ice that's on the wing. And then we apply a type 4 fluid, which is a very thick fluid that creates a layer that sits on the wing. And it typically is a color. You'll see sort of a greenish or orangish, depending on what they've used, sort of color. And the idea behind this is it absorbs falling precipitation during the time the airplane is outside before it takes off. The type 4 fluid, the second application, is designed to absorb that precipitation. It can only do that for so long. So we have what we call a holdover time, which is in these conditions at this temperature, how long is this fluid going to be good for? And we've got all that data in the cockpit, so we know what time we were de-iced. The de-ice administrator on the ground is going to talk to us and say, we completed this application at this and this time, and we start the clock and so forth. So then what happens is when we get out to take off, as we accelerate down the runway, that fluid shears off the top of the wing. And if you actually are in a position to watch it, you'll see that the faster you're going, the more of it you'll see starting to slip off the back of the wing. So that by the time you lift off, it's gone. But it's also taken with it all the precipitation that it was absorbing, so we don't have anything adhering to the wing at the time we lift off, which is the goal. And it works really well as long as you stay within those holdover times. And this is where, you'll have, long lines for departure, and sometimes passengers will experience this where they think they're about ready to go, and then the captain has to come on and say, sorry, folks, but we've exceeded the holdover time for the de-icing. We got to go back and do it again. And, those nights get ugly.
Yeah. Okay. The terminology is making more sense though now. So can you explain, there's some other terms that I think get thrown around that perhaps are confusing to passengers, like ground stop and gate hold. Are those related to icing?
They can be. They are more typically, those official terms are more typically related to air traffic control delays, where the system has just got too many airplanes in it, and they're going to hold you at the gate, or you've already left the gate and they have a ground stop, which means nobody's taking off until we make some room for you in the sky. And that may seem a little silly, but if you look at the traffic density, it can get, particularly at large metropolitan areas. So those terms will be used for that, but it's also very, very common to have significant delays for de-icing, because it just takes a long time. I mean, it can be a 10 or 15 minute process per airplane.
History of de-icing. You were talking about type 2 and type 4. How has de-icing morphed over the years?
Well, I think
from like the rope days.
Yeah, from the rope days. And I mean, people were more sophisticated than we were in those days. I mean, flying cargo at night was a whole different world. The whole idea of icing has been a challenge for a long, long time because of this idea that a little bit of it is okay. So it's hard to get across ideas of what we call the clean wing concept, which is that the wing has to be clean at takeoff. So for a long, long time, it wasn't. And as I explained, when we were dragging snow off with a rope, we obviously didn't completely clean the wing, and we still had success. And a part of that is because we had older airfoils, slower airplanes. We didn't really push the margins that much. And I think, so we end up, again, you build this body of success. And we had ground icing accidents long before. I mean, 1949, 1951, I can think of a whole number of them that happened throughout the 50s into the 60s. But then we got to the jets, and the jet wing basically was rather more unforgiving than the old reciprocating engine airplane wings. So it just tended to not give you anywhere near the margin. And so we started to have some pretty noticeable jet de-icing accidents. And that extended really up through the early 90s. And it was during that period of probably the 80s and the 90s that the research really got underway to develop new fluids besides just spraying the wing with alcohol, which was the early approach. And it works, except it doesn't last. So you clean the wing off, but it's still snowing. So by the time you get to the runway, you get more ice on the wing. So in that 80s and 90s period, the research really started to accelerate to develop these sophisticated fluids that really do a good job with this.
Okay, so this is ground de-icing, but like my first thought when you're talking about all of this stuff flying off by the time you're in the air, can't you pick up ice in the air as well? And what happens there?
Then we get to the in-flight icing problem. So this is kind of an interesting divider that you've highlighted. We put a lot of effort into ground icing. And then we get to the in-flight icing issue. And with transport airplanes, people, jet airliners and so forth, they are all designed with ice protection systems. So typically the leading edge of the wing is heated, and you operate the ice protection system when you get into conditions that are conducive to icing, and it prevents ice from accreting on the leading edge of the wing. Smaller airplanes, regional airline turboprop type airplanes use a pneumatic boot system, a rubber boot on the leading edge of the wing. that expands and contracts. So it has to allow some ice to accrete, and then you operate it and it breaks the ice off. Not quite as good, but done very well for a long, long time if you use it properly. So we have ice protection when we're in flight. The challenge is using it at the right time, making sure that it's done its job. And in many cases, we have accidents when people don't use it. We get into this idea that, a little bit of ice is okay. If you're operating a pneumatic boot system, like I was just describing, you're going to have to wait for some ice to accrete because it doesn't work if there's no ice to break off. So it sort of invites you to allow ice accretion. And then the question is, how much do you allow before you operate the system? And that's where we kind of get into some problems from time to time. But mostly, generally speaking, the jets all have what we call a hot wing, which is just a thermally heated leading edge. And that pretty much takes care of the problem. We just don't really see any in-flight problems there.
Okay, let's talk about who's in charge of this. Is the pilot the person making the final call, yes, it's safe to fly? Or is that air traffic control, somebody on the ground? Who's in charge?
The pilot in command, or the captain in the airline, same thing. Pilot in command has the final authority and the final responsibility. That's codified in regulations, which can be a little bit annoying to some employers because the pilot in command actually is responsible externally to his employment. So he has the final authority and the final responsibility for the safety of the passengers above anybody else. Nobody else could say, to go. If he says we're not going, we're not going. So he really does have a pretty significant responsibility there. And from the icing standpoint, he does make the final decisions as to whether everything's been done satisfactorily, acceptably, met the standard. There's a requirement to do a check after you've been de-iced, and that sort of thing. So but that is his call at the end of the day.
Or hers.
Or hers, yes. I'm sorry, and I should have brought that up. But you're absolutely right.
No, it's fine. We do that with doctors and meteorologists too. I've heard people say that they smell maple syrup when the plane is being de-iced. Is that true?
I don't know if I've heard that one.
Okay, that's not a thing.
So the normal procedure is you turn the environmental systems off during the de-icing process. And we usually try to make an announcement. Look, it's going to get kind of stuffy and warm for a few minutes while we do this. And then once we get done, we'll turn it back on. But depending on how that works, it's not uncommon for some aroma to enter the cabin. And I don't think I've ever heard it referred to as maple syrup, but it's been noticed.
Gotcha. Are there any types of planes that are better at handling ice than others? Have you noticed in your years?
We do a lot of research on that. And, we're really looking at wing designs to see what wings maybe do a little bit better with this, or not so much what wings do better, but which wings are we sure don't do better? Because again, I think we have to be careful that we think we can outsmart this. It doesn't let us do that very well. And I think, as I was saying earlier, when you go back and look at a lot of older designs, they were susceptible to ice, and they racked up quite a few icing accidents over the years. But when we consider the environments they were operated in and the scarcity of good knowledge on icing, they probably had a better margin that they were operating in. So they weren't exposed, or they didn't encounter the actual critical thresholds quite as readily as you would with a more modern airplane at this point. On the other hand, the modern airplanes have a fair amount of power. There's some things going in their favor as well. And again, this is where we kind of get in trouble when we make assumptions that one airplane is better than another. It's really common to hear, or used to be common to hear pilots say, well, my airplane can handle a lot of ice. And, as we got into this research, particularly after Roseland, we're like, your airplane, you don't know anything about what your airplane can do. And that's what we've really been trying to promote and change. And we've been bringing about quite a bit of improvement on our understanding of that sort of thing in the last 30 or 40 years.
So is pilot education like a massive part of this?
It is. It has been. And it's a really interesting problem to deal with because of these older ideas that really took hold in the 1920s, early 1930s. I did a paper a number of years ago that looked at all of these early research documents that drew conclusions that were really not accurate. And that kind of information kind of got embedded in the culture. And it was really up until the Roselawn accident before we really started unraveling that and changing the culture to improve our understanding of what was going on.
Do you have much knowledge of the 1982 Air Florida in DC? Do you have any information or any light you can shed on that?
What happened with Air Florida is it's a fairly egregious example of the classic problem we were having with icing, which is people just didn't appreciate how significant a small amount could be. And they, really did not get the airplane cleaned off. And, it came back to bite them. I mean, it was really, really unfortunate, but they just didn't really have the experience. The policies, standard operating procedures were not as robust, anywhere near as robust as they are today. And, it wasn't as if they were being intentionally careless. I think that's always a mistake people make with accidents and so forth. It was simply that the knowledge and experience didn't exist at that point. And they got kind of walked into something. Now, other people might not have, but it was, not as far-fetched at the time as it would be today.
What kind of new research and technology is being worked on as far as de-icing, or is it becoming more of a let's change like the standards and let's change this linear scale that we have? Or is there new like goop that's being created to throw on planes that will last longer?
Well, there's always guys involved in trying to research the goop. I mean, that's become a real thing because one of the problems with it is enormously expensive. I don't think I can quote a number off the top of my head, but we're probably looking at $20, $30, $40 a gallon. I mean, it's really expensive, and they use a lot of it. So
like, if you had to de-ice a plane twice, approximately what do you think it would cost?
I don't really know what it would cost, but I'd be willing to bet easily that it wipes out any possible profit from that flight. Oh. I mean, you just ate the whole thing, and the only reason you're doing it is because you got to keep a schedule. So the result of that is that a lot of research goes into how do we improve the fluids? How can we make better fluids that are cheaper and more versatile and easier to use and easier to store and et cetera, because we have to heat them. We have all kinds of processes that are involved, and anything anybody can do to kind of reduce that is where a lot of the research gets aimed. It's worth considering that in terms of air safety, since we started into this post-Air Florida ground de-icing program, and that was really the accident that got it started, and then it developed through the 80s and 90s, but we still had some events in the 90s. We had US Air at LaGuardia, a couple of DC-9 freighter operators got hurt. But anyway, the point is, since that program really got established, we haven't had any ground de-icing accidents involving transport airplanes. Now, I think we just had one up in Bangor a few weeks ago with a business jet. But involving scheduled air carriers, the ground icing program has really, really been successful. We just And that's not to say that we couldn't have one. I mean, knock on wood. In the accident world, you don't ever want to think you've got the whole thing licked. But we really, in terms of air safety, it's one of the standout accomplishments is that we've really improved that particular situation considerably. Technology-wise, though, like I said, the fluid research is significant. Other research into particularly the anti-icing systems, de-icing systems on board the airplane. They're also expensive. They're hard to certify so that they get approved by the FAA. People are always interested in those types of, in improving those systems so that they use less energy or require less energy, because you consider that with the unmanned aircraft wave that everybody's excited about, they're battery-powered airplanes. And you start trying to tap the battery for the energy you need to de-ice it, you're going to sap the battery pretty quick. So lots of people are interested in better ways to de-ice while you're airborne so that we can save energy. And, where that leads, I don't know. But
of all the things to replace, do we really need to replace pilots? Like, I'll take a real person.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have a fairly strong opinion about that too. But but if you look at the energy sources, if you look at where people are headed with new technology in aviation, the power source overall is a big deal. I mean, people are trying to burn new fuels, green fuels, artificially generated fuels that don't generate the exhaust outputs, and we're trying to minimize damage to the atmosphere. Big push toward electric airplanes, whether they're manned or not, using electricity as some form of a power plant. And when we get to the icing question, that's going to be an issue. Because, like I say, when we're using aviation fuel, we've got a lot of excess energy if we want it that we can tap. If you're using batteries, you don't have any excess energy. And you're going to need it if you're going to keep the airplane free of ice.
Interesting. The things I would never think of. Okay, so that's a concern. Do you have any other concerns about the future of flying when it comes to ice?
I think the biggest thing is the education thing. And we still have that linear scale in the Airman's Information Manual. It makes some sense on one level. For example, it's also worth considering that a certain amount of ice on a small airplane has much more effect on that airplane than the same amount of ice on a larger airplane. So if you're out there in your little Cessna and you pick up X amount of ice on the wing, that could really take you down. The same amount of ice on a 737 may not even be noticed. So it's a very, very scale-sensitive problem. So that linear terminology and that subjective terminology, if you look at how we define light, moderate ice, and so forth, the terminology makes sense from that standpoint. The problem is that the effects of ice are just not linear. And it leads to a mental model that's not accurate. And that's the educational problem that we have. It not only it leads to a mental model that's not accurate, but it also challenges the pilot, because if he's going to fly professionally and try to make a living flying airplanes, he is going to encounter ice. He will probably, if he's really smart and pays attention, he will avoid all the thunderstorms. But there's no way he's going to avoid all the ice. So you're going to encounter it. And now what? How do you manage that? How do you understand what's happening? What decisions do you make with that? And that's an educational challenge, probably more than anything else.
As a pilot, is there ever like a battle of, like, I'm thinking about this, it's late at night, you're de-icing for the second time, airline pressure, because this is costing money, passenger pressure, you're tired. Like, is it hard to make the right decision?
Oh, it can be. I mean, it's and you really outlined some of the conditions that really come into play. I've had situations where the flight and duty rules establish a certain amount of time you can be on duty, and beyond that, you can't go beyond a certain point. But as long as you depart before this time, it's all fine. And you're sitting there and you got about 9 minutes left before the clock runs out, and you got to depart. And now what happens is somebody comes up with a problem. because if you decide anything, you're just timed out. So you can feel these pressures build. And obviously the operator wants you to go, depending on, I mean, I can say that with a major airline, you don't ever hear any pressure from the company. I mean, the captain is well respected, and you're not going to have somebody calling you up trying to, say you're going to lose your job if you don't do this or that. I mean, but that stuff can happen at smaller operations, charter operations, corporate flight departments, this sort of thing. And I've certainly encountered it in my career. And one of the challenges of being the captain is you got to be prepared to say no and stick to it. And it's, it can be a little bit of a challenge, but that's your job. You got to be able to say no. And I remember years ago when I was flying the freighter, we landed at Buffalo. Very, very windy night, and we couldn't even open the cargo doors. The wind was so strong, and we were supposed to go on to Toronto. And I was flying with the chief pilot. I was the co-pilot in those days, and he was really interesting character. But he told the station manager, he said, "Don't even bother to open her up, Al. We're not going to Toronto." And so he called dispatch and told them, and they were like, "Oh, okay, whatever you say." Sure enough, a few minutes later, the company owner calls him up, and we all know what this is about. He's gonna. So they have a subdued conversation in the corner, and pretty soon John hangs up the phone, and he comes back and he says, "Well, we're not going to Toronto tonight. I already made that decision, but now Jim's blessed it." And it was a real lesson to me in what that pilot responsibility role is. It's your decision. When it gets hard like that, you got to be prepared to stick with it. Having said that, you can't just make it arbitrarily. You really do need to know why you're deciding this, because the company does have a vested interest in trying to operate. So you can't just make it up as you go. But once you've made an educated, informed decision, that's it.
From the passenger perspective, that gives me comfort. Also, the knowing that they're not getting pressure from the airlines is comfort. Is there anything else you can offer as far as words of comfort to passengers trying to fly today, like in the middle of winter weather?
I think the overall passenger experience is a really interesting thing, because unlike anything else, they don't have any control once they're in the airplane. And I've made this argument in a number of presentations before, but if you're on a ship at sea, at least in principle, you think you could lower one of the lifeboats and float away. If you're on a train, you could convince yourself that in the right circumstances, you could jump and survive. Nothing like that can happen in the airplane. So you are completely at the mercy of somebody else's control. And that's a unique human experience that we underestimate how significant that could be. Some estimates will say 25% of the people on your airplane are really nervous and uncomfortable. And that's probably realistic. And we can make all kinds of, cute statements about, that the pilots are up front. They're the first ones that are going to get hurt. They're making decisions for themselves, if not for you, because it's all this nonsense. The point is, the airline crews really, really understand this safety obligation. It's been really promoted. It's become part of their education. A lot of the older school folks have long retired, and newer folks, they don't necessarily have the same depth of experience, but the education they're getting is a lot better. And they really do understand the safety issue. And I think the companies understand it. I mean, everybody who wants to operate airplanes and make money with them understands that you can't have anything happen. You have to do what's necessary to make sure bad things don't happen. And I don't think anybody doesn't take that seriously. Now we could argue about different levels of knowledge and experience and so forth that are in play, but everybody takes the safety issue very seriously. So the people who are up front making these decisions while you're sitting there wondering what's going on, they're not doing it in a vacuum. And I'm not going to say that everybody gets it right every single time. We know that's not the case, but everybody definitely is committed to getting it right.
Off the Radar is a production of the National Weather Desk. Make sure you're following the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes publish every Tuesday. Thanks so much to Steve Green for his expertise today, and to Chris Bossetti for introducing us. Special thanks to Jay Mishkin from the National Weather Desk for his help writing today's episode, and to Brian Petras from Sinclair Broadcast Group for his ongoing support of the show. I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie. Make it a great day.